Hi everyone, thanks very much for joining us this morning for this ISM Trust webinar, all about setting your tuition fees. The ISM Trust is the ISM, the Incorporated Society of Musicians sister charity, and works to create pioneering resources to support all of those that work in music. And the ISM Trust also seeks to educate and inspire through a range of webinars, seminars, events, and both printed and digital resources. My name is Sam Flower. I'm Marketing Officer at the ISM. And in today's session, I'm delighted to be first joined by statistician Alex Naylor, who will talk you through the results of the ISM's latest survey of teaching, examining, and accompanying rates. And then later on, I'll also be joined by my colleague from the ISM, Jeremy Dunn, from our legal team, and he'll be speaking to you about unpaid fees and how to handle such a situation if it arises for you. During the two presentations, please do put any questions that you might have into the Q&A panel, and we'll do our very best to answer these towards the end. And also do keep an eye on the chat box where we'll be dropping in some useful links as we go. Before we begin, just a couple of technical points. If you experience any technical difficulties, such as sound quality issues, just let us know in the chat box and we'll attempt to resolve this. And if you wish to use them, subtitles are available by enabling them at the bottom of your screen. And just a note as well, the webinar is being recorded, so it will be available to watch back via the ISM Trust website in a few days' time. So do keep an eye out for that. And just so you know, that is ismtrust.org/webinars. And that's it from me for now. So I'm pleased to hand over straight away to Alex for the presentation all about our latest fees survey. So thanks very much, Alex. Over to you.
Thank you, Sam. I'll just share my screen. So that's the first technical thing to do. So if that doesn't work for anybody, obviously let us know. So hopefully you can all see my screen now. It should say ISM Fee Survey 2022, Alex Naylor. So yeah, so hi, I'm Alex, and this is the second year for me running the fee survey. So started, first time I ran it last year, which was quite interesting with obviously.
Well, Alex, I'm so sorry to interrupt. We can't actually see your screen at the moment.
Right. Let me see. Let's go back to Zoom. So share screen, screen two. I think I forgot to actually press share. Can you see it now?
There we go. Yes, thanks very much.
Yeah, I went for the sharing, but forgot to actually press the share button. That's better. Perfect. So second year for Naylor Research Partnership running the ISM fee survey, and so last year was a pretty challenging year with COVID and trying to get the sort of experiences of everybody during COVID, different types of teaching, obviously online teaching becoming quite a big thing, as well as sort of going into schools, sometimes not going into schools, other times, and especially things like accompanying and doing examinations were very difficult last year. So last year's survey was quite tricky and some sort of had some interesting findings, but also things we weren't necessarily 100% sure about because how reliable various bits of data were because of the different things people were going through. So it's been good to be able to do this again this year, where things are a little bit more stable, although obviously there are still a lot of COVID issues, around, but things are starting to become more stable and sort of see how things are progressing for people as things get sort of back to normal. So sort of key things that we found this year is that the numbers answering the survey were up quite a bit, which is great. We're not back up to the pre-pandemic levels of numbers answering the survey, but we did have a lot more than we'd had the previous year, which is great because that hopefully means that a lot more people are getting back into being able to teach. And the other good thing is that fees have remained either stable or increasing. So even last year with COVID, we did find that the fees, hourly rates and things were increasing for a lot of people, and with that still happening as well now, which is a good thing. So, although lots of people have probably seen their numbers of pupils maybe decreasing and things like that, which hopefully again will be picking up, people are still generally managing to take the same fees and charge the same fees as they have been before COVID. And what's really been really good from the COVID experience is that a lot of people have obviously started doing online remote teaching. A lot of people were forced into it, of course, over the last few years, and lots of people did say they had it, they had problems with it, pupils didn't like it, and so on. And so what's great is obviously that people now have largely been able to return to face-to-face teaching But a lot of people did find that they enjoyed teaching remotely. It allowed them to reach more people. It allowed people to go have lessons where maybe they wouldn't have time to travel somewhere for a lesson. And so a lot of people do seem to still be using online teaching and finding it quite a good success, and also being paid the same rates as they are for face-to-face teaching as well. Another thing that we've seen from last year is that the number of employees within state schools or working within state schools has increased quite a lot on last year. So last year's survey, a lot of people said who normally were employed in schools and said, they just hadn't done any work in schools because obviously restrictions. Schools were closed and some of the time, or when they were open, they were only open for certain groups of children, or they were focusing on, say, the academic subjects, or they were just, it was too much hassle to do music lessons with all the cleaning and sanitizing and so on. So a lot of people who normally would be employed in schools hadn't been doing that work. So although independent school employees were still getting quite a lot of work. So it's good to see that this year a lot more people have been able to return to teaching within state schools. But we're still seeing a lot of comments about COVID having impacts on people's work. So still things like not being able to teach as many pupils, because especially within schools, there's still a lot of kind of, obviously not restrictions as such, but a lot of protocols around cleaning between students, and obviously the sanitizing and all these sorts of things, and changing equipment and things like that. So people still are having, this is still having impacts on people, but also a lot of people who maybe didn't, left their music teaching during COVID because either, they weren't going to school, or they didn't have the money to pay if it was private teaching and so on. A lot of those people maybe haven't gone back to the lessons for various reasons. So, the impacts of COVID are still there, but, looking like not as much as they were last year, which is good. So the sample that we collected this year, as I already mentioned, it's quite a lot larger than last year, which is good. It had about almost twice as many respondents as last year, which was great. Nearly half of those responses we collected during September. So although the survey ran from September to mid-December, the majority, or nearly half of the respondents replied in September, sort of hopefully at the start of the school year. And that's quite promising in itself, and it's suggesting that a lot of people were able to go straight back into work in schools and so on when the school term started. We see the same trend that we've seen in the last like 3-4 years of the majority of the sample being from London and the southeast of England. And so, it's hard to know whether that's because that's where more of the jobs are, or because for some reason there's a skew towards those people answering the survey. But what it does mean is whenever we're looking at fees and so on, it is important to bear in mind that there is a large proportion of the sample from the 2 areas of the UK that tend to charge more money. So that's just something to be aware of there. As with previous years, there was not very many responses from Wales, Northern Ireland, and numbers were also low for Scotland, Yorkshire, and the northeast of England had dropped in response size quite a bit as well. Yeah. And again, continuing trends seen in the past couple of years, a huge proportion of the respondents have a lot of teaching experience, been teaching for more than 15 years. So I sort of noticed this last year and the year before, with data from the year before, and it's a slight concern. I mean, it might just be that the people with more experience tend to answer the survey because they've got, they're more, they know what fees they're charging rather than looking at the results to see how much to charge. But it is interesting to see that such a large proportion have been teaching for such a long time. So that's just something, again, and something to be aware of. Of course, if we've got such a large proportion of the sample with so much experience, it may be that those people might charge more than maybe somebody who's only got a year or two's experience. And more than half of our sample have got some form of a university degree or a master's degree, PhD or higher, either in music or in teaching. And piano and organ are still the most popular instruments taught. So over half the respondents teach piano or organ as their main instrument. So that the sample itself, demographics are largely comparable to previous years. So we've always had that skew towards London and the southeast of England. and piano. Piano has always been a pretty popular instrument, I think. It's interesting, I was thinking maybe we might see increases in people doing things like vocal teaching and so on now that the COVID restrictions are sort of not as strict as they were, but we're still seeing that the sort of piano and organ being the key instrument. And so we asked people about 4 different types of teaching or employment in music. We can look at private teaching, teaching in schools both as an employee and as a self-employed, and accompanying work and examination work. And so when we ask people about if they've done any private teaching, nearly all of the sample this year have done some face-to-face private teaching, which is great. And that's almost the same as what we saw pre-pandemic in terms of that. And of course, we wouldn't necessarily expect 100% of the sample to do face-to-face private teaching because some people may only teach in schools, be employees and so on. So that's great. We're seeing almost, back to pre-pandemic as to how much face-to-face teaching people have been able to do. And we did see obviously a corresponding drop in remote lessons, which is not surprising because people now, some people did say that they didn't enjoy doing online teaching, or their pupils didn't enjoy online teaching. But it is good to see a lot of people say found remote teaching a really positive thing that they've been able to do. And we've seen that 63% of the sample was still running lessons both face-to-face and online as well. And also hourly rates have slightly increased for online teaching from last year. And we now see people generally charging the same rate for both online and face-to-face teaching. And again, I think because a lot of both teachers and pupils in certain situations have recognised actually the benefits of being able to do the teaching in that way. And rates have continued to rise between £2 to £3 per hour, which is the same sort of increase that was seen last year. See, it was less, could be less confident on it being a real increase last year because of COVID and obviously a lot of people not being able to teach. But it's good to see that that's continuing. That £2 to £3 an hour increase is still continuing into this year. Although interestingly, London didn't particularly change. So we saw the increase in rates more outside of London than inside London and the Southeast. But rates in London and the Southeast are still remain significantly higher than they do in the rest of the UK. And that's what we've seen in previous years. And so say rate increases are steady, about £2 per hour as well. So not everybody had increased fees this year, which is what we see every year, but more than a third of respondents had increased their fees from last year, and nearly half expect it to increase again in the coming year. So that's a really good sign as well, because a lot of people had commented last year on not raising fees because they didn't feel they could, because they didn't necessarily feel they could teach in the same way because things were teaching remotely, or they were losing pupils, so they didn't want to lose more by increasing their fees, or they knew people were struggling obviously with furloughs and not working and so on. So it's good to see that sort of quite large proportions of the sample are feeling like they can now sort of start to increase their rates again. It's good. And we also saw increases in the number of clients, which we would have expected to see, which is great. So median number of clients reported for private teaching was 13, up on last year. And we also asked last year about increases in numbers of adult clients, because it was thought maybe with people being in furloughs and things like that. I was interested to see whether people had more adult clients than they'd had previously, and a lot of teachers did say that they did. And we saw on average about 30% of private clients at the moment were adults, which is another increase on what we saw last year. We didn't ask about that prior to the pandemic, so it can't say that that's definitely an increase, but it seems to have been that maybe more adults are kind of taking up private teaching, or took it up during the pandemic and are continuing with that. So then looked at teachers who are employed in schools. So look at both teachers employed in schools and people who work as self-employed teachers in schools. And so the proportion of employees, or the proportion reporting that they're employed in schools, is still quite low on what it was pre-pandemic. So it's about a quarter of the sample here. But it's increased a little bit on last year, but not very much at all, which kind of goes along with what a lot of people have made comments about, saying things like they just haven't not being offered work anymore, especially people who are working in things like music hubs, specialist music schools and things, some of which obviously closed down during COVID. And there have been a lot of comments from people just saying, I've just not been offered any work since COVID there. So something to be keeping an eye on into next year, to hopefully see that maybe those numbers start increasing. And we're still seeing a high proportion employed at independent schools, or although, as I mentioned at the start, we're seeing an increase in teachers returning to state schools as employees, but nowhere near as high as it was, say, pre-pandemic. And compared to previous years, we've got a really high proportion of the sample in London, in the southeast, for employees, teacher employees, which is interesting. It was a very relatively kind of even spread across the country for employees in previous years, whereas, say, very high proportion based in London and the southeast this year. So when we're looking at quite large increases in rates, that could be largely due to just the fact that we've got, say, quite a lot of the sample in those areas. So we can only sort of speculate as to why that might be. It might be that schools in London and the southeast have found it easier to return to lessons, or it might just be because there's more independent schools in those areas. But yes, just something again to bear in mind when we look at the rates. And so for employees in schools, you saw that the hourly rate, median hourly rate, rising to nearly £34 an hour. As I say, a large part of the sample is in the areas of the country that receive more money. So we see, for example, in outer London, rates are noticeably higher, which they were also last year, so at nearly £40 an hour. And rates in London and the southeast remain significantly higher than the rest of the UK, and as they do also with in independent schools as well. Rates are significantly higher than they are in state schools and music schools and so on as well there. And so, as I say, it's looking that things are getting back to normal within schools, rates are increasing and so on, but as I say, we do need to take that with some caution because of the high proportions teaching in London and the southeast. What was good to see was that about a third of respondents said that they'd had an increase in their hourly rate in the previous year, and another sort of more than a third expect to have an increase in the coming year as well, which again is good because a lot of people did report fees have stalled obviously during that COVID time. And it was also nice to see that 55 respondents said that they were able to teach groups and ensembles in this year, as opposed to last year when very few teachers were able to teach in any groups because of all the COVID restrictions. So we then moved on to looking at self-employed teachers working in schools. So again, the numbers reporting that they've done self-employed teaching in schools have increased slightly again on last year. So we've had about 35 or 34% of the sample able to do that in this coming academic year. Still, again, low on before COVID, but increasing again slightly. But the good thing to see was that we saw that the proportion of people teaching in state schools has risen a lot since last year. So we now got about 40% of the people teaching in independent schools and about 40% in state schools there. So again, suggesting that maybe schools with sort of less resources and so forth have been able to start bringing back music teaching in schools, which is great. And again, the hourly rates have risen again, a couple of pounds again, as they have done in previous years and as they have done generally in private teaching and in employees in schools there. But again, we do have a high proportion of respondents from London and the southeast in this sample as well. So again, we've always got to take that carefully, just to kind of remember that the sort of all of the numbers here are going to be quite skewed towards London and the southeast, which tends to charge higher rates there. And again, rates in independent schools are significantly higher than they are at state schools, and also significantly higher in London and the southeast. there. What's really interesting to note was the median rate in inner London, which has actually dropped to below the average rate in the rest of the UK, or the median rate in the rest of the UK. Don't know why that is. I mean, it was, inner London was lower than outer London and South East last year, but not by such a vast amount. So that's just an interesting trend to keep an eye on. And self-employed teachers working in schools, we asked them about remote teaching as well, which we asked about last year. And a lot of self-employed teachers, so about half, had still been teaching remote classes as well as, or instead of face-to-face teaching. But again, with private teaching, it's nice to see that the fees for teaching these are the same for both online and face-to-face, which is good, because last year we were seeing slight differences between the two. So online teaching was receiving slightly lower fees. So it's good to see that now that people have recognised that online teaching can work, people are able to charge the same fees. And so we saw also an increase in respondents who put their rates up this year, so 35% compared to just a fifth last year. But the amounts of increases were generally small, just about £1 an hour there. And also what's key to notice is 2/3 of people who didn't have an increase in rates this year have said that they don't expect their rates to increase next year either. So whether that's because they're not choosing to try and increase their rates, or whether schools have said we can't increase rates, we don't know. But that's compared to private teaching and employees, we're seeing that the people are kind of expecting their fees to stall a bit in this area at the moment. Yeah. We've seen average pupil numbers increasing, but not by a huge amount either. Obviously, a lot of people mentioned losing pupils during COVID, and we've seen slight increases, but not huge amounts. And as we see, again, seen in the same trend for the previous years, that self-employed teachers tend to earn significantly higher median rates than employees, which is not to be expected. But the gap has narrowed, so it's just over £2 per hour different now. So the final section that we asked about is accompanying examiners. So, I mean, last year we really had very little data about this, because it's just so limited, the opportunities to do this kind of work. We had a bit more responses about accompanying work this year. So about 20% of the sample had done some form of accompanying, whether that was examinations, festivals, accompanying choirs, playing organs in church, and so on. So the data still has to be taken quite cautiously, because the numbers are relatively small once they're broken down into the different categories. But we see hourly rates ranging from about £33.50 for accompanying exams up to £50 per hour for organists in church. But as I say, it's quite cautious data there. And then we see again that 12% of people had their work streamed online, such as, for example, organists in church and examiners and things. That was about the same proportion as last year. But interestingly, over half of people have not actually been paid for this, whether that was their consent or for the actual work itself. And that's not changed from last year either. So it's that's something to be interesting to look at going forward, if kind of doing things online and remotely continues to be a trend, to see whether people continue to be doing this sort of work but not actually being paid for it. Yeah. And then the final piece of data we looked at was working as examiners, but as with last year, the numbers for this were still very low. Only 27 people reported working as an examiner there, so we didn't look at that data any further. Hopefully, in the coming years, those numbers may be able to increase again. So thank you for listening to that. And it does say any questions, but actually I'm going to hand back to Sam and Jeremy first, and then we'll have any questions. But thank you very much for listening.
Thanks very much, Alex. Really insightful look at the survey results there. I do have a couple of questions myself, but yeah, we'll get to those at the end once we've heard from Jeremy as well. So yeah, Jeremy, I'm going to hand actually straight over to you. So Jeremy is my colleague from the ISM legal team, and he's going to talk to attendees on the call today all about unpaid fees and hopefully how to avoid those situations, but also how to act appropriately if such a situation does arise. So Jeremy, I'll hand over to you. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Sam. Right, what I'm going to do today, after Alex's lovely presentation, is to talk to you about getting paid. Now, essentially, there is no way you can be 100% sure of ever getting paid unless you ask for that payment up front. But of course, most people won't pay you up front. So these are some tips of how to make sure you give yourself the best chance whatsoever of being able to obtain your payment. Now, the first thing is getting a contract in writing. And there are all sorts of contracts on our website that you can look at. If you don't understand any of them, you can contact us and ask. That's fine at legal@ism.org. And if you want to amend them, you can amend them, but also send them in to us to check that they're still working. There are other things you can do. You can just give your contract, if you're writing them themselves, to a friend and ask them if they understand it. And if they don't understand it, you can be fairly sure that it needs clarification. Okay. Now, there is always a contract in place, but what we're going to say is you've got to have a written contract in place because you've got to prove those contractual terms. So if you do agree a contract verbally with anyone, either on the net or on the telephone, best practice is to put those conditions in writing to the other person and ask them to confirm or basically say, no, that's not what was agreed. But it needs to be in writing. Now, the key things in writing that you will need is the name of the person you're contracting with. If it's a company, you need that business name. If it's another person, a client, then you need their full name. You will need their address. This is where so many people come unstuck. With the internet, people contract all the time with people, but if you don't have a street address for the person you're contracting with, you are leaving yourself open to not getting paid. Because if you want to take these things further to court, you need a street address. That's how the court system works. That's how county court judgment works. So if you don't have a street address, you won't be able to take it further if someone refuses to pay. So get a street address. And there's also, if possible, certainly with a company, try and check that that address is correct. Use the internet, do the research. What else has a contract got to have? Well, it's got to have your fee. And it's also got to have the date of when the performance or the service is being provided. And also cancellation terms. People will cancel contracts. Now, if you don't have a cancellation term in there, it basically leads up to what is reasonable, which is a decision, if it goes to court, that a judge will make. Why let a judge choose? Put it into the contract. And again, you can look at all sorts of contract cancellation terms in our contracts on our web. Right, so everything's in place. You've got the contract in place, and you perform the service, the performance, the tutoring. The next step is to put an invoice in. Make sure that invoice has everything in the contract. So it's the name of the person that contracted you. It should be invoiced. If, for example, in a tutoring situation that one person signs a contract, but the other parent is the one you're in communication with, it's the one who signed the contract for you. When you're putting forward a contract, an invoice to someone, make sure the payment terms are reasonable. Most companies, most human beings have a payment run, and that's usually once a month. I certainly don't pay any bills until I get paid for my work. So be sensible. If you're invoicing someone and asking for payment the next day or the day after, the likelihood it isn't going to happen. And the likelihood is you're just going to irritate yourself and stress yourself out. Obviously, making those payment terms and when you expect to be paid in the contract also helps a lot, but also be sensible with payment terms. I would always say a month is a reasonable time period, because everyone will usually get paid at the end of the month. So if they don't pay you, you know there's a problem. Otherwise, you're just going to sit there waiting, drumming your fingers, why aren't I being paid? When it may well be that they just simply don't pay in the middle of the month. Invoice should have what you're charging for, and the dates and the place where the service is going to be done, has been performed, and the amount due, and also how you want to get paid. If you want to get paid by check, it should say so. If you want to get paid by bank transfer, it should say so. Now, if you send the invoice out, you give reasonable payment terms, and you don't get paid, send a reminder. Give less time, cut the time down to about 14 days. That's perfectly reasonable. And just send a reminder invoice, and also send the first one again. Okay, and that's the process you should do so. Now, if someone basically argues that they don't get paid because they're claiming that you breached the contract in some way whatsoever, send it to us at legal@ism.org, and we will give you a view. And you should do it that straight away, because why put yourself through the stress of arguing with someone if you may not need to? Okay, so send it to us, and we will always give you a view. Try not to argue back. I know that's sometimes hard when people are trying to avoid paying fees. They can be aggressive, they can be rude, they can accuse you of all sorts of things. Try not to engage with it. Send it to us, and we will give you a view on it. Now, if you can't get paid, we, the ISM, have an unpaid fee service that you can use. And what you do then is you send us all the details you have of the contract. So we need the contract, we need an address, we need an email address, and we need any relevant correspondence. Okay, and specifically in relevant correspondence, we need evidence that the other side have received the contract and agreed it. Now, that doesn't automatically mean that they have to sign it and return it. If you can show that you sent it to them and that they've acted on it, i.e. by attending a lesson, by giving a payment for the lesson, that's confirmation the contract is in place. So make sure that's done. Send in the invoice. What we will do is we will then draft a letter to the third party if we feel we're able to. Obviously, if we feel that you haven't got a case, we will tell you and we will explain to you why. But if you do have a case, we will write to the third party on your behalf. We will make sure that a draft of the letter gets sent to you first, so you can check it, make sure that you're happy with the tone, make sure the details are right. Once you have confirmed you're okay with that, we will send it off to the third party, and we will generally give 14 days for payment. And if we don't get a response, we will send a slightly strongly worded further letter giving 7 days for payment. What then happens if you don't get paid is that we basically provide our members with a legal expense insurance. Now, remember, this is a legal expense insurance. It is not income protection, because no one can afford income protection insurance. So what this is a legal expense insurance. Like all such insurances, it has caveats. And basically, the biggest one is, first of all, you should be informing them of the issue as soon as possible. So if you're waiting 3 or 4 years to pursue something, it's probably not going to be taken up by the insurance company because it breaches that clause. Another thing to also look out for is that they have a clause in the policy that it has to have a reasonable chance of success. Now, what that means is that it's got to be assessed at a 51% chance of success or further. And that assessment will generally be done by some panel solicitors they use. And if it doesn't pass, they won't pursue it. Okay, so, and this is why getting all those things in writing, everything in place, can only increase your chances of getting paid, because the insurance company will be looking for those exactly things. Now, if the insurance company accepts it, what will then happen is that they will either appoint solicitors to pursue it in county courts for you, okay? And then you will be that solicitor's client, and they will issue proceedings and they will sort everything out and take it to court if need be. The insurance company can also do something else, which is basically look at the proportionality of the payment, and if they believe pursuing it in a court will cost them, in terms of paying solicitors' costs, more than the debt is worth, they will probably offer to pay that debt. Now, if they do so, that is not them paying the non-payer's debt, that is the insurance company paying off their debt to provide you legal insurance. So if the insurance company does that, you can still actually pursue the case against the third party in court yourself. And if you want to do that, again, we can't act for you in the ISM legal department, but we can give you some guidance as well. And I do know some members that have done exactly that. So if you like, they've got paid twice for the same breach, once by the insurance company and once if it reaches court. Now, the insurance company won't take claims under £100. So in those sorts of cases, if the ISM legal department can't get paid, but you want to take it further, again, we will try to guide you through the proceedings. But remember, we can't act and we can't give advice on litigation because basically we're not insured to do so. So, but that is something you do. If you are going to take it to court, there are certain things you have to think about. First of all, if someone defends, the case is always sent to the defendant's nearest county court. Now, obviously, if the person's in the same town as you, that's fine. But obviously, if the client is, 300 miles away, that means you're going to have to travel 300 miles for a court date. So think about that sort of thing. Is it worth it to you? Nobody really enjoys going to court. Nothing bad will happen going to court, but it's stressful, it's tense, and it takes time to get there. So if you're pursuing something like £30, £40, £50, you need to think about whether or not it's worth it to you for the amount of stress and time it's going to take up. But obviously that's your decision, and we will provide whatever guidance we can for you on that. Other key things you need to think of. When there's a breach of contract, when someone isn't paying something, there is something you have to do under duty, which is called mitigate your losses. What this means is you basically treat the matter as if the breach was your fault. And what that means is you go out and try and replace the work. So, for example, if you've got a date, if someone's booked you for, let's say, a wedding in 3 months' time, and they cancel with 3 months' time, you should have a good cancellation clause, but that clause is only effective if you've actually suffered a loss. And if you can replace that work with no loss, there's no loss, and you can't claim, because the county court system is there to put you in the same place as you were as if the breach hadn't taken place. But if you can replace the work, you haven't lost any earnings. And there is a duty for you to try to find work. You treat the matter as if the problem was yours and that you wouldn't just sit there and not get paid. You would try and seek a remedy yourself by seeking work. And that's what the law expects you to do when there's a breach of contract. Okay. Other key things to watch out for is make sure you keep the correspondence. Emails or whatever, keep it. Make sure, put it in a file so you can keep it specifically to prove certain things, that the contract has been sent, what's being said by whom, and why. So keep it and send, as I said to you, send it all to us if you need us to pursue a case. And remember, we're here to help you, but we won't always be able to get your payment. If someone hasn't got money, even if you take the matter to a court, if the other person hasn't got any money, you might get a settlement at payment back at £5 a month. I've known that happen. Again, is it worth it? If the person really has got no money in pursuing them to a county court, it's probably not going to really help you very much. But again, if you have questions about that sort of thing, do email us at legal@ism.org, and we will give you advice. Okay, right, I've finished talking now. If anyone has any questions, just let me know and I'll answer them as I can.
Thanks very much, Jeremy. Really insightful, lots of practical tips to take away that I'm sure will be very, very useful to those on the call this morning. I actually had a question for you whilst we await any of the attendees' questions in the chat box. If you had like one top tip that you could give teachers in particular, as we're talking about teachers' fees, for avoiding kind of unpaid fees, what would that be?
I mean, certainly if you're a teacher, I often think this: if someone can afford to pay you a term's tuition at the end of the term, they can probably afford to pay it at the start of the term. So if you can get payment before the lessons begin, do so. I mean, certainly I always think about it, particularly in the autumn term. When is someone more likely to have £300 to pay for a term's lessons? Is it going to be in September, or is it going to be just before Christmas? So if you, in that sort of situation, I can never see why people don't try and get the money up front. So I think, but the other key thing is make sure you get a street address. Really do. Without a street address, basically, if you don't get paid, you're not going to get paid.
Right. Yeah, really insightful again. Yeah, not something I knew in particular with regards to the street address. So yeah, really useful advice. So thanks very much. And then Alex, just turning back to you. Thanks for your presentation on the survey results. Again, really insightful. I'm sure it'd be very useful to those on the call this morning. My question that I had for you was there anything about this year's results that surprised you, particularly as you obviously compiled last year's survey as well? Was there anything that kind of you were a bit surprised by, any differences between the two results sets or with this year's results in particular?
Yeah, that's good. I mean, I was quite surprised by the large number of remote teaching that was being done, actually, because see, last year so many people had to do it because they were forced to, and there was lots of conflicting comments. People loved it, people hated it. So I was quite surprised to see such high numbers still choosing largely to do it as private teaching. But I think in the long term, it's probably a good thing. I mean, quite a lot of people have said, "Oh, it means I can teach people halfway across the country." I think it was last year, she'd moved from London, let's say, but kept all of her clients because she was teaching them all online. So I was really, I was pleasantly surprised by that. And I was sort of kind of surprised by the drop in fees in inner London for self-employed teachers, or kind of the shrinking of the difference between London and elsewhere, which I was thinking, I don't know if is that maybe just because London didn't feel the effects of COVID so much last year, or is everywhere else becoming more generous? We'll see.
Right. Yeah, I mean, certainly with regards to the remote teaching element, that surprised me as well from the results set, and it was really, like you say, a pleasant surprise in that teachers are able to continuing offering that as a service and have been able to reach people across the country or indeed internationally in many cases. So yeah, really positive for some teachers there. See, I don't think we've had any questions from the floor just yet, or from attendees on the call this morning. So yeah, as a reminder, do pop them in the Q&A box if you do have any questions. And we'll obviously do our very best to answer those. I was just wondering as well, Jeremy, with regards to the template contracts that ISM members can access, it's kind of a complete range of contracts, isn't it? So for those on the call this morning that might do other work on top of teaching work, they might do performance work or accompanying work as well. Is that something that we have template contracts available that make it kind of nice and easy?
Absolutely. We try to put template contracts for everything that a professional individual musician may come in contact with, or certainly the ones we see a lot of. So there's composers ones, there's performance ones. I think there's 3 types of tutoring ones. But if you need another one, you can always email us, and we will try and provide one.
Perfect. Yeah, again, really useful. So yeah, do check those out on our website, and the link has been posted in the chat for all the different templates available. Alex, I can see we've had a question from you for you from the floor. just with regard to the survey results, and that was, is there an available breakdown of the results by different regions of the UK? So the Northeast, for example.
So no,
yeah.
we haven't, and because the numbers really, once we break down to that smaller, large, to those regions, are generally just too small to be sort of giving sort of reliable results, reliable differences. So I mean, there aren't any massive differences noticed this year between, you know, the different regions of the UK, apart from London Southeast versus the rest. But yeah, because so much of the sample is based in London and Southeast, once you start breaking down the other regions of the UK, the numbers just become too small. And actually, that was the case even prior to COVID, when we had sort of more people responding. So, you know, but there weren't any noticeable differences between the different regions. Yeah, it's one of those you don't like to report when the numbers are too small.
No, totally. Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, well, I don't think we've had any more questions come through, so I think we'll wrap things up. So thanks very much to both Jeremy and Alex for presenting today's webinar, and thanks to everyone that attended. As we mentioned at the start, today's session was recorded and it will be available to watch back on demand in a couple of days' time via the ISM and ISM Trust websites. And that the link for that is in the chat. And just so you know as well, it's ismtrust.org/webinars. The website at the moment, if you had to have a look at it, at the moment you'd see a whole range of our archived webinars covering a huge range of topics, everything from copyright through to diversifying your music lessons to setting up business structures and lots more. So do check out our full range of webinars on demand, and they're all available for free as well. If you want to be among the first to find out news of upcoming ISM Trust and ISM events, as well as news from the ISM and the wider music sector, you're welcome to sign up to our monthly free newsletter. We'll be putting that together this week, so it goes out at the end of the month. So the link to sign up to that newsletter is in the chat too. So do please sign up to that. And very last thing for me to say is just thanks very much again to Jeremy and Alex, and to all of you that attended this morning. I wish you a great rest of the day, and we hope to see you at another ISM Trust event very soon. Thanks very much, and bye for now.
Cheers. Bye-bye.